I'm Eoin Colfer, author of the Artemis Fowl series, and this year, believe it or not, is the 10th anniversary of the release of the first book. And I'd like to read the prologue of the very first book for you now. And this brings us right back to the beginning, before we knew who Artemis was. And this prologue comes from the case files of his psychiatrist. How does one describe Artemis Fowl? Various psychiatrists have tried and failed. The main problem is Artemis's own intelligence. He bamboozles every test thrown at him. He has puzzled the greatest medical minds and sent many of them gibbering to their own hospitals. There is no doubt that Artemis is a child prodigy. But why does someone of such brilliance dedicate himself to criminal activities? This is a question that can be answered by only one person, and he delights in not talking. Perhaps the best way to create an accurate picture of Artemis is to tell the by now famous account of his first villainous venture. I have put together this report from first-hand interviews with the victims, and as the tale unfolds, you will realize that this was not easy. The story began several years ago at the dawn of the 21st century. Artemis Fowl had devised a plan to restore his family's fortune, a plan that could topple civilizations and plunge the planet into a cross-species war. He was 12 years old at the time.
Today I'm going to be interviewing you about your Artemis Fowl books.
Okay.
And some of your other books as well.
I'm ready.
As a child, were you inspired by stories of fairies and leprechauns?
I think a lot of writers' inspiration comes from their childhood, especially children's writers. And I was very directly inspired by my dad, because he used to tell me stories about fairies and leprechauns that he just made up from the top of his head. And even at that age I knew, I wish I could write stories like that down. And so as soon as I could write, I began to write down stories like my dad's. So it was a very direct inspiration from my childhood.
What made you make yours high-tech?
As a reader, Keith, you know how many really fantastic magical stories are out there already.
Oh, yeah.
With all Narnia, Lord of the Rings, there's just so many of them. And especially in Ireland, where every Irish writer going has a go at writing a fairy story. So I knew to make mine interesting to readers, I had to bring something else to it. And it occurred to me that if the fairies had managed to stay hidden for so long from humans, that they would have to be very technologically advanced. And that was like a light bulb moment. I thought, that's the thing.
On average, how long would it take you to write one of your books?
An Artemis book takes me about 10 months, and then I probably have to do an edit. So the whole thing would take maybe a year. But I'm not working for that entire year. A lot of the time I'm on tour, maybe for 2 months. I go on holidays with my family, so that takes another month. So altogether, hard work, it could boil down to about 9 months or 8 months.
In all the Artemis Fowl books, there is a coded message written across the bottom of the pages. What gave you the idea for this?
Well, when I was a little boy, I was a member of the Warlord Club. Now, you don't remember that, but the Warlord was a comic book that would come out, an English comic book. And if you joined the club, you could get secret code messages every week, and you'd be able to decode it. So when my editor, Sarah, said, there's codes in this book, why don't we make a code? I thought it was an amazing idea. And so I wrote a special little piece for every book. And if you want, you can go and decode it. But it's quite tough going to do the whole book. But a lot of people do.
The first book that I read of yours wasn't an Artemis Fowl book, it was The Legend of Spud Murphy. Did you have a librarian like Mrs. Murphy when you were young?
We did. Now, she wasn't as bad as Mrs. Murphy is, but we believed she was terrible. I think when you're very young, you believe stories about grown-ups that couldn't possibly be true. We were told, I remember in school, that our chemistry teacher had blown up a lab in Dublin and killed 47 people, and now he was only allowed to work down the countryside. And we said, that's fantastic. Now, obviously, I know now if someone blows up a lab and kills 47 people, they're not going to be allowed into a school. But at the time, we believed this and we thought this was a mysterious character and he was a mass murderer. But so when we saw this mean-looking Mrs. Murphy, we believed she was terrible. But as we got to know her, we realised she was very kindly and lovely. She just looked a bit grumpy in the mornings.
Oh, so Miss Murphy was an actual person?
It was, but I just call her Mrs. Murphy now. That wasn't her real name. Because I couldn't say that, she might be upset. Well, I think she actually died, but it might be upsetting to her family, so I changed the name.
Okay. Is it really true that there are to be no more Artemis Fowl books after the next one? Do you have any more children's books planned?
Yeah, it is true that number 8 is the last one, but I do have more children's books planned. I'm hoping to start a new series, a trilogy, and the first book should come out next year. And then my plan is to do one adult book, one children's book, one after another.
Okay. Here's a question from Luca 777. What was your favourite book when you were a child?
Well, it's hard to pick one, but if I had to pick just one, I would say Stig of the Dump. I always loved that book, and I remember reading it several times in one weekend. And I don't know, maybe you've read it yourself?
Yeah, I have. I
Yeah.
think I had it as school reader one time.
It might be a bit younger than you are, maybe for a 9-year-old.
Yeah.
It might be suitable, but I really love that book.
Here's a few from Rock and Roll J. Why do you like the name Artemis Fowl?
I liked Fowl because it sounds like Foul, which is nasty.
Yeah.
So his name sounds like what he is. And Artemis was the Greek goddess of the hunt. And it was only given to a boy as a name when he was a really great hunter, as an honorary name. So it really suited the first book because he was the nasty hunter of fairies. So his name says what he is.
Why did you decide Artemis should be 12 in particular?
Well, I wanted to start him at 12. And at the time when I was writing, I was teaching 12-year-olds. So I wanted to kind of observe the kids in my class and see what they found funny and what they found exciting. And then so I wrote directly for them. Even though I never read any of my stuff to them, I was writing with them in my mind.
Okay. Were there any Artemis Fowl-like people in your classes at school?
There were a couple who were quite dodgy characters that I definitely took some inspiration from. But there was nobody quite as nasty as Artemis is starting off the first book, but definitely a few characters.
Why do you think Artemis Fowl should have a butler loaded with guns and explosive stuff?
I just think that's a kind of a fantasy of all young boys to have a protector. So if the school bully comes over to torment them. And when I was a little boy, I was very small and there was these guys used to annoy me a little bit. Not serious bullying, but just a little bit of annoying. And I often dreamt that I had this big butler who would come along and he would jump over the school wall and grab these guys and say, "You leave my friend alone," and they would, but obviously that never materialized, but I managed to hold on to the idea of butler.
Here's a couple from Andrew. As an adult, I love the Artemis Fowl books and similar children's and young adult novels such as the Alex Rider and Harry Potter books. In your opinion, why are these books as appealing to adults as they are to children?
Well, I think there was a fashion a while ago to make children's books very simple and to imagine that kids weren't as smart as grown-ups. And I think that's a big mistake. I think most 12-year-olds are just as smart as any adult, but they just don't have life experience. I remember being totally fed up with kids' books. I would read people like Stephen King or all the thrillers I could get, Alistair MacLean, that kind of stuff. And they were meant for grown-ups. So when I started to write, I said, well, if I was reading grown-up books at 12, why shouldn't I write a book that's quite complicated and would appeal to 12-year-olds and grown-ups? And so that's what I did. And I think that's what Anthony and JK do also. As
the next Artemis Fowl book will be the last Artemis Fowl book, which books would you advise Artemis Fowl fans to read?
Once you run out of Artemis Fowl books, then I would say Anthony Horowitz stuff is really good, all the Alex Rider stuff. And he has other series as well, which are also good. I think the Charlie Higson books are fantastic, Young Bond, and now the Enemy books, the zombie books, I would advise them. For the girls, Jacqueline Wilson is fantastic, but also Kathy Cassidy is really wonderful. There's so much choice. I think it's a great time to be a kid. There's more choice of really good stuff out there than there ever has been, and more ways to get it. You can get it on your iPhone, your iPad, your computer, in the library, from the bookstore. It's great. It's a great time to be young, a young reader.
Another thing that quite a lot of people and book lovers in particular are quite worried about is the government is proposing to shut down a lot of libraries.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
And I think it's terrible. I mean, libraries are where people go to become educated after school. And so many people, writers and artists, have begun their careers in the hallways of a library. To lose that is going to be a terrible thing. And it's a great place that anybody can go to get away if they have trouble in their life or hassle in their life, or there's kids bullying them. It's not going to happen in the library. So they always it was more than a place to read. It was a refuge from the troubles of your daily life. And to lose that is going to be heartbreaking for a lot of people.
Thank you for being a good interviewee. It's been a pleasure interviewing you.
Well, Keith, it's been a pleasure being interviewed by you. I feel I've emptied my heart and soul. I'm going away to cry now.